It was late at night, and Katrina found herself alone in her creaky old house. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down her spine. She had always loved her solitude, but tonight felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, almost ominous, that she couldn't shake off. Katrina was curled up on her couch, lost in a book, when she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible knock on the front door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be at this hour? Slowly, she set the book down and made her way to the door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. On the porch lay a small, neatly wrapped package. There was no note, no indication of who it was from. Curiosity got the better of her, and she brought the package inside. Sitting at the kitchen table, Katrina carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a small clown doll, about a foot tall. It had a painted white face with exaggerated features, bright red hair, and a sinister grin. She felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at it. There was something unnerving about its eyes. They seemed almost lifelike. Katrina placed the clown on a shelf in the living room and tried to shake off the unease. She returned to her book, but her mind kept drifting back to the clown. Hours passed, and as the clock struck midnight, she decided to head to bed. She climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Just as she reached the top, she felt a sudden draft and turned to see the clown sitting at the bottom of the stairs. She gasped, her heart racing. She was sure she had left it on the shelf. Trying to calm herself, she rationalized that she must have moved it and forgotten. Katrina picked up the clown and carried it back to the living room. This time, she placed it inside a cabinet and shut the door tight. She returned to her bedroom, but she could not fall asleep. She tossed and turned, her mind playing tricks on her. Hours later, she heard a soft thud. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. There it was again, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from downstairs. Fear gripped her as she crept out of bed and tiptoed down the stairs. The house was dark, and the only sound was her own breathing. When she reached the living room, she saw the cabinet door was wide open. The clown was gone. Panic set in as she frantically searched the room. Then she heard it, a soft giggle coming from the kitchen. She edged closer, her heart pounding out of her chest. The kitchen was empty, but she could feel eyes on her. She slowly turned, and there it was, the clown, sitting on the countertop, its grin wider than before. She backed away, but the clown's eyes seemed to follow her every move. Katrina bolted for the stairs, but halfway up, she tripped and fell. She turned to see the clown at the bottom, slowly climbing each step. She scrambled to her feet and ran to her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She pressed her back against it, panting, trying to catch her breath. A soft knock echoed through the wood.
Katrina.
A whispery voice called from the other side. She screamed, her fear reaching a crescendo. She had to get out. She threw open the window and looked down. It was a long drop, but she had no choice. She climbed out, dangling by her fingertips, and let go. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but she forced herself to stand. She hobbled to the front yard, glancing back at the house. The clown was in the window, watching her, its eyes gleaming with malice. Katrina ran, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop until she reached her neighbor's house. She banged on the door, and it flew open to reveal her neighbor, a kind old woman named Mrs. Wilson. "Katrina, what's wrong?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her face filled with concern. Katrina tried to explain, but her words came out in a jumbled mess. She glanced back at her house, half expecting to see the clown following her, but the street was empty. Mrs. Wilson took her inside, offering comfort and safety. They called the police, but when they arrived and searched Katrina's house, there was no sign of the clown. The package was gone, the cabinet door was shut, and everything was in its place. The officers didn't believe her story, chalking it up to a nightmare, but Katrina knew the truth. She could feel the clown's eyes on her, even now, as she sat in Mrs. Wilson's warm kitchen. The terror of that night would haunt her forever, a constant reminder that some gifts should never be opened. Peter always loved the quiet. After years in the bustling city, he relished the peace and solitude of his new home deep in the woods. It was a small, secluded house surrounded by towering trees, miles away from the nearest neighbor. He thought it was perfect. One chilly October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Peter settled into his favorite chair with a book. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves outside and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you hear things you didn't want to hear, like the creak of the floorboards upstairs or the soft whisper of the wind through a slightly open window. Peter had just started to lose himself in his book when he heard it, a knock at the door. It was a firm, deliberate knock that echoed through the house. Peter frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He got up slowly, his heart beating a little faster than it should. He opened the door, and no one was there. Just the empty darkness of the woods staring back at him. "Hello?" he called out, but there was no answer. He stepped outside, peering into the shadows, but saw nothing. With a shrug, he went back inside, locking the door behind him. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and returned to his book. But the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Peter jumped, his book falling to the floor. He went to the door and yanked it open, ready to confront whoever was playing this prank. But again, there was no one there, just the cold, empty night. Peter felt a chill run down his spine. He closed the door and bolted it, checking the windows to make sure they were locked too. He went back to his chair, but he couldn't focus on his book anymore. His eyes kept darting to the door, his ears straining to hear any sound. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the house. He froze, listening as they moved from one window to the next. Peter's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there was no signal out here. The footsteps stopped, and everything went silent. Peter held his breath, waiting, but nothing happened. Maybe it was just an animal, he told himself, trying to calm down. He decided to go to bed and put this strange night behind him. But as he climbed the stairs, he heard a noise from the kitchen. It sounded like the back door creaking open. Peter's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and crept downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was wide open. He knew he had locked it earlier. Peter shut the door and locked it again, his hands trembling. He turned around and froze. There, in the hallway, stood a man. He was tall and stocky, with piercing eyes and a wicked grin. He held an axe, the blade gleaming in the dim light. Peter backed away, his mind racing. The man took a step forward, swinging the axe casually at his side. Who are you?" Peter stammered, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He just kept coming, his grin widening. Peter swung the bat, but the man caught it with one hand, yanking it out of his grasp. Peter stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The man loomed over him, raising the axe. Peter scrambled to his feet and ran, darting through the house with the man close behind. He slammed the door to the basement and locked it, his breath coming in frantic gasps. He could hear the man pounding on the door, the sound echoing through the house. Peter searched the basement frantically for something to defend himself with. He found an old toolbox and grabbed a hammer. The pounding on the door stopped. Peter waited, listening. There was a crash, and the lights went out. The man had cut the power. Peter's heart raced as he fumbled in the dark, trying to find the flashlight he kept near the base of the stairs. He found it and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. He could hear the man's footsteps upstairs, moving slowly, methodically. Peter knew he had to get out. He found a small window in the basement and pried it open. It was a tight squeeze, but he managed to crawl through. He ran into the woods, the flashlight bouncing in his hand. He could hear the man behind him crashing through the underbrush. Peter ran blindly through the trees, branches scratching at his face and arms. He tripped and fell, the flashlight flying out of his hand. He lay there, panting, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the man getting closer, his footsteps quicker by the second. Peter scrambled to his feet and kept running, the darkness closing in around him. He could see a light in the distance, a faint, flickering light. He ran towards it, his lungs burning. As he got closer, he realized it was a cabin, an old, dilapidated cabin. He burst through the door and slammed it shut behind him. He looked around frantically, searching for something to block the door. He found a heavy table and pushed it against the door, his hand shaking. He could hear the man outside, his footsteps slowly approaching the cabin. Peter backed away, his eyes darting around the cabin. It was empty, except for a few old pieces of furniture and a fireplace. He grabbed a poker from the fireplace and held it in front of him, his hands trembling. The man started pounding on the door, the sound echoing through the cabin. Peter backed into a corner, his heart pounding in his chest. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. The door began to splinter, and Peter could see the man's evil grin through the cracks. Peter closed his eyes, his breath going in and out, faster and faster. The door burst open, and the man stepped inside, his axe gleaming in the dim light. Peter swung the poker, hitting the man in the shoulder. The man didn't even flinch. When he swung it a second time, the man caught it easily, ripping it from Peter's hand and tossing it aside. He raised the axe, his grin widening. Peter screamed, the sound echoing through the cabin and out into the dark, empty woods, his world forever turning black. Cindy sat alone in the living room, the glow of the TV casting eerie shadows on the walls. The night was dark and still. The only sound was the low murmur of the television. She curled up on the couch, a blanket pulled tightly around her. Her parents were out of town, and she had the house to herself for the weekend. She tried to focus on the sitcom playing on the screen, but her mind kept wandering to the old house's creaks and groans. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft thumping, like something bumping against the ceiling. Cindy's heart skipped a beat. She muted the TV and listened. The thumping continued, an erratic, persistent noise coming from above her head. She glanced nervously at the ceiling, her imagination running wild. Probably just a raccoon, she told herself, trying to shake off the unease, but the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate. Cindy stood up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and slowly made her way to the attic stairs. She hesitated at the bottom, staring up into the dark, creepy space above. With a deep breath, she flicked on the light switch and climbed the stairs. The attic was a dusty, cluttered mess, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. Cindy scanned the room, her eyes finally landing on an old trunk in the corner. The noise seemed to be coming from there. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out and opened the trunk. Inside was an old ventriloquist's dummy, its painted face grinning up at her. She shivered, remembering the stories her grandmother used to tell her about the dummy. It had belonged to a long-dead relative who had been a famous ventriloquist. Cindy's grandmother always said the dummy was cursed, but Cindy had never believed her. The dummy lay still, its lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. Cindy shook her head, feeling silly for being so scared. She closed the trunk and turned to go back downstairs when she heard it again, the thumping. She turned back to the trunk, her eyes wide with fear. The lid of the trunk was slowly opening. Cindy froze, unable to move as the dummy's head slowly turned to face her. Its eyes seemed to come alive, glinting with a malevolent intelligence. It climbed out of the trunk, its movements jerky and unnatural. Cindy backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The dummy held a small, sharp knife in its hand. It grinned at her, a sinister smile that sent chills down her body. It moved closer, its eyes never leaving hers. Cindy tried to scream, but no sound came out. She turned and ran down the stairs, the dummy's laughter echoing behind her. She slammed the door to the attic and locked it, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone and tried to call for help, but the line was dead. No calls were going through. The house was silent again. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. She backed into the living room, her eyes darting around for any sign of the dummy. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of movement. Cindy began to think she had imagined it all when she heard a soft, scratching noise coming from the hallway. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The dummy stood there, its head tilted to one side, the knife glinting in the dim light. It took a step towards her, then another. Cindy stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. The dummy's grin widened as it approached her, raising the knife. Cindy scrambled to her feet and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a butcher knife from the drawer. The dummy followed her, its movements slow and purposeful. It seemed to savor her fear, taking its time. Cindy swung the knife at it, but it was too quick. It dodged the blow and slashed at her leg, drawing a thin line of blood. She cried out in pain and swung again, but the dummy ducked and cut her arm. Cindy was bleeding, her strength fading. She backed into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. The dummy moved closer, its knife ready to strike. It raised the blade, and Cindy closed her eyes, bracing for the pain. But the strike never came. She opened her eyes and saw the dummy frozen in place, its eyes lifeless once more. The knife clattered to the floor. Cindy didn't wait to see what would happen next. She grabbed the dummy, ran upstairs to the attic, and shoved it back into the trunk, slamming the lid shut and locking it. She backed away, her breath coming in sobs. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hand shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. This time, the call went through. The operator answered, and Cindy poured out her story, her voice trembling with fear. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the house was silent again. They searched the attic and found the trunk, but the dummy was gone. Cindy was taken to the hospital, her wounds bandaged, but the fear remained. She never stayed in that house again. Years later, Cindy still had nightmares about the dummy. She could never forget its lifeless eyes, its sinister grin, or the sound of its laughter. The house was sold, and the new owners never knew about the evil that lurked in the attic. But Cindy knew. She knew it was still out there, somewhere.